Virginia presidents. On October 1st, we launch the National Constitution Center's Constitution Drafting Project. We have commissioned 3 teams, Team Conservative, Team Libertarian, and Team Progressive, to draft a constitution as if in the state of nature. It's an amazing group of scholars. They're going to tell us how they think a constitution from scratch should read, and I can't wait to share them with you. We also have great programs in October on immigration and on Robert Putnam's new book, The Upswing, and I hope you'll join us for all of them, as well as tuning into our weekly podcast, We the People. And now it's such a pleasure to introduce the amazing panelists for this program tonight on the First Amendment, journalism, and the protests. We will be taking your questions throughout the program on Zoom, so put them in the Q&A box and I will introduce them as appropriate. And now it's time to introduce our guests, and I'll do that in alphabetical order. Congressman Steve Cohen has served as the US representative from Tennessee's 9th Congressional District since 2007. He, since 2019, has been chair of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. Rich Lowry is the editor of National Review. He was selected to become editor by William F. Buckley in 1997 and is the author of 4 books, including Lincoln Unbound and The Case for Nationalism, How It Made Us Powerfully United and Free. Suzanne Nossel is Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, the leading human rights and free expression organization. She is a leading voice on free expression issues and has recently published the new book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. And Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon serves as the US representative from Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District. She currently serves as vice chair of the House Judiciary Committee, as well as serving on the House Rules Committee and the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Congressman Cohen, Rich Lowry, Suzanne Nossel, and Congresswoman Scanlon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, Congresswoman Scanlon, thank you for convening us, because it was your insight that we should indeed convene a group of thought leaders in America to discuss a problem or a question that you flagged in a resolution that you introduced in Congress in June of 2020. That was a resolution that you introduced with Congressman Schiff. You denounced violence against the press in the US. You called on law enforcement to protect freedom of the press and refrain from targeting journalists. You stressed the need for accountability when law enforcement entities or protesters violate the Constitution, laws, or regulation in their treatment of journalists, and you reaffirmed the centrality of press freedom. Your resolution identifies a series of specific incidents against journalists or media workers being specifically targeted by law enforcement with tear gas, pepper spray, or pepper balls. And they begin in your list, whereas on May 29th, 2020, police in Minneapolis shot a rubber bullet at the face of a freelance writer and photographer, permanently blinding her in one eye. And you have a series of other examples, and you note as well that the leading press watchdog organizations have, you said that as of June 4th, the US Press Freedom Tracker, a nonpartisan website managed by the Freedom of the Press Foundation, has received reports of more than 300 reports of press freedom violations committed against journalists covering the demonstrations in the wake of the murder of George Floyd nationwide. So tell us, why did you introduce the resolution? What are some of the specific incidents that concern you and led you to introduce the resolution? And what do you think that Congress should do about it?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for providing us with this forum. I've worked with the Constitution Center and Constitution High School for the past 14 years. So it's such a powerful organization, and having the ability to convene people on a bipartisan basis to discuss such central issues to our nation, it's really such a valuable service. So thank you for bringing everyone together. In the wake of George Floyd's death, we did see across the country, we saw a series of protests, and early on in those protests, we saw some opportunists come out, and there were incidents of violence and incidents of looting. Now in Philadelphia, we had a weekend of that, which has since ended. Although protests for racial justice have continued throughout our region. And it was really striking to see in Philadelphia and elsewhere that police were actually explicitly targeting journalists who were identified as journalists. They had press badges on. I think many of us saw the detention of the CNN reporter live on camera during the morning news hour. Here in Philadelphia, we saw reporting regarding the detention of multiple reporters from the Philadelphia Inquirer, from the Wilmington papers. You mentioned the reporter who was shot with rubber bullets and lost her eye. And so we saw vividly occurring on camera a series of attacks and detentions of the press, which is not something that we have seen in this country on the scale, certainly, that we did. And this is a country that has experienced a lot of protests in the past. So something had shifted. And that's why I felt that we needed to have a resolution in the sense of Congress that this is not okay. And this is a deviation from the norm, and we need to put an end to it. And it was really interesting as I got into drafting the resolution, because Congress does a lot of these resolutions talking about the integral role that a free press plays in democracy, but it has not had to do one of these resolutions regarding US police forces in recent years. Congress has done a lot of resolutions talking about violations of the free press in other countries, but until the last few years, it has not been an issue in the United States of America. So that was the impetus for this resolution. If anyone wants to look at it, it's House Resolution 999, makes it very easy to remember. But that was the genesis for it, the fact that something very, very important had shifted, and given the role of the free press in reporting on what is going on in our streets so that the citizenry have accurate information, that if our members of our press in the United States of America were being detained and were being, in some cases, targeted with rubber bullets and pepper spray, et cetera, that was an important thing that we need to take note of and stop that action.
Many thanks for all that, and thanks for giving the name of the resolution so that viewers can read it. Representative Cohen, in June, you chaired a hearing of the Helsinki Commission on human rights at home, media, politics, and the safety of journalists to assess the state of media freedom. The hearing noted that according to US Press Freedom Tracker, there have been nearly 500 reported press freedom violations since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States on May 26th. There were witnesses at the hearing, including Christine Amanpour of CNN, David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion, and other distinguished witnesses. Tell us about the hearing. Tell us about what your conclusion is about whether the attacks on journalists noted by US Press Freedom Tracker represent an increase from historical levels in the US, and how do we compare to what's going on around the world?
Well, the hearing was in July, and it was a successful hearing. One of the most amazing things about it, I guess, in my perspective, I've been on the Helsinki Commission for quite a while, and we go to hearings and meetings in Vienna and other places. And what we always hear is of authoritarian governments in generally formerly Soviet bloc, newly freed in the last couple of 3 decades countries, suppressing the media, Soviet Russian style tactics. And you see it in Hungary, and you see it in Poland, and you see it in the Czech Republic and other places. And you kind of think of it as like, they do that. That's so bizarre, and it's so outlandish and sad that that goes on over here. And it's so important that OSCE is the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, Helsinki Commission, is concerned about that and keeps an eye towards protecting press freedom and First Amendment rights. And we go on trips, we hear from people in the community, activist groups, civic activist groups, and they always are concerned about. I've been in twice in Belarus, and they were all concerned about the lack of freedoms that Lukashenko was taking advantage of. And of course, he just gets rid of his opponents. He's pretty mainlines it at the first layer of opposition. But Christiana Amanpour, that eponymous show, said that it was so shocking that there are now 500 allegations of police and other attacks on the press in America. And she said, it was shocking to her from her base in England also to see that this was happening in America. And it's shocking to me. It is just amazing. And of course, it all comes from Trump. And he started off with fake news. And his first thing he did as president was to say he had the largest crowd in the history of the Washington Mall, and it was bigger than Obama's, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then the press caught him on it, and his press secretary had to get up there and lie for him. And then the press showed where he was wrong, and then he called it fake news. And from there on, it's been over 20,000 lies. And he keeps calling it fake news, and he puts up things that encourages people to attack the reporters, and has people at his rallies look at the press, and he says nasty things about CNN, and they look at them and jeer, and it's somewhat it's chilling to think that it's so much like the 30s in Germany. It's not that much different. So yeah, the hearing was good. There was the idea that now it's come to America, and it's come to America through Donald Trump, and it came to Donald Trump through Vladimir Putin. So the same things we saw in Europe, which all came from Russia and the old Soviet bloc nations and his people that emulate him, it's the same thing we see in America. And it all goes back, I guess it goes back to Putin, not so much to Trump, because he gave us Trump. And as I thought this today, it's just when we let in, I was looking at your building, We the Constitution. The Constitution and journalism, free press, both under attack. And those were two of the Benjamin Franklin's most important things. Benjamin Franklin signed the Constitution, helped write it, was a journalist, and was a big advocate, the first Postmaster General. And what are the three things most under attack right now? The post and the press and the Constitution. And the press partially because Trump's mad at Bezos, and he sees a way to get at Bezos by controlling the post office and trying to get them to raise rates on his Amazon business because he doesn't like what he's saying at the Washington Post. So it's just astonishing that one of our founding fathers, who nobody has any problems with, he's one of the few people that have escaped the tyranny of the masses, and still has reflections and statuary standing firmly and without enemies, is being attacked on all fronts: the Constitution, journalism, and it's just so sad, and the post office all at the same time.
Thank you for those comments. Rich Lowry, strong words from Representative Cohen, accusing the president of essentially fomenting, if not inciting violence to a degree that he said we've not seen before in the US. And you heard Representative Scanlon as well saying that the attacks on journalists at these rallies are occurring at a rate which we've not seen before in the US. National Review and your distinguished writing have both strongly defended the First Amendment and also defended police and law enforcement. What is your reaction to what you've heard from Representatives Cohen and Scanlon?
Well, first of all, Jeff, thanks so much for hosting this event. Thanks so much for what the Constitution Center does. Pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. So I would say a couple things. Obviously, if police deliberately target and harm journalists, they should be held accountable and charged with crimes, if appropriate. But I think we need to be aware that these are chaotic environments. The police are very often being attacked. The riots have not been as limited as a congresswoman portrayed at the outset of remarks. I wish they were, but they haven't. And I guess my question about the resolution would be, if attacks on journalists are always wrong, which I believe there are, why wouldn't the resolution also highlight the attacks on the journalists by Black Lives Matter protesters and Antifa protesters? Those would seem to be just as bad, just as malicious, just as much of a threat to the First Amendment. Somehow that, I guess that's beneath notice, or the congresswoman and congressmen aren't concerned about those attacks for some reason. And then I take it as a given that both the congresswoman and the congressmen are extremely sincere in their concern over this issue. So I just wonder if they have actually talked to the Democratic mayors, the Democratic city councils who run these cities, who have run them for decades, and run the police departments. These local police departments do not report to Donald Trump. They report to these mayors and to these municipal bodies controlled by Democrats. In one case, Portland, the Democratic mayor and the Democratic police commissioner are the same person. So I appreciate all the heated and hyperbolic rhetoric, all the partisan slams on Donald Trump, but that seems to be beside the point, because if police, local police, are deliberately targeting journalists, that is an issue for local officials and for fellow my congresswoman and congressmen, for their fellow Democrats. So have they brought this up with Democratic mayors? Have they told them that they're running fascistic police forces that are cracking down on the press like 1930s Germany? I mean, that's a pretty heavy charge, and I think it should be raised with the people responsible for these police forces.
If I can,
if I could just keep in order, we're going to follow the Supreme Court rule that Chief Justice Roberts has instituted of kind of going in line, and we'll come back and have a chance for rebuttals. Suzanne Nossel Penn has been involved in important lawsuits defending the First Amendment, and there are two lawsuits that Penn is not involved in, but I'd love you to talk about. There's Goyette versus City of Minneapolis, where the ACLU filed a class action lawsuit against Minnesota's state and local law enforcement officials in an attempt to hold police officers who target journalists accountable for their unlawful actions. And then there's also a case out of Portland, Index Newspapers versus City of Portland, where a US district judge issued a restraining order blocking the police from dispersing, arresting, or threatening to arrest or using physical force against journalists or legal observers at protests. But in August, the Ninth Circuit stayed that order, saying that the other side was likely to win or show success on the merits. So if you could, tell us about those or other lawsuits.
Sure. I want to start by taking a step back and first acknowledging that this issue is not entirely new. We did a report back in 2014 on press freedom violations in the context of the Ferguson protests, and we documented 53 violations. So I think it's important to recognize that these tensions around protests are longstanding, and you could go far further back than that. The other piece I would bring in is that this is part and parcel of a larger campaign against protest and freedom of assembly rights. And we did a report that we issued actually right in May, just before George Floyd's murder, called Arresting Dissent, that talks about the 117 different bills that have been introduced in state legislatures across the country to curb protest rights in all sorts of different ways, limiting protests on federal facilities, on highways, enhancing penalties. 23 of those have passed. So there's a climate of adversarialism against protest in general. And I think that is a lot of what we're seeing spill over into the press. And just to give the very latest stats, it's actually up to 746 press freedom violation incidents in the context of the protests as of today. 102 arrests, 185 physical attacks, and on down. And just to Rich's point, 80% of those attacks documented are by police, state troopers, law enforcement, and 20%, as you point out rightly, are by protesters themselves. So that is an issue, but the proportions need to be recognized. I think what this represents is a loss of respect for the role of the press in a democracy. As police sometimes overreach in their approach to managing protests, there is no sense of boundaries when it comes to the press. And we've seen this even in cases where, like the arrest of Omar Jimenez from CNN, when he's hauled away right on camera, and clearly he's peaceful, he's not disorderly in any respect, and yet he is handcuffed, followed by his cameraman, and finally his producer. So these two lawsuits that you referenced are targeting the recognition that First Amendment violations are taking place here, and that we need to make more distinction between rights of protesters and the special role that the press plays in these instances. So the Minnesota suit is a class action against the State Patrol, the police, and the city. The lead plaintiff was shot in the face by a rubber bullet. And it's really recognizing and asserting that journalists are there to protect the protesters, to document what's happening, to hold officials accountable. If they are interfered with, then assembly rights as a whole are in jeopardy. And then in Oregon, there's this very specific request for an injunction, as you mentioned, that would prevent police from dispersing journalists, threatening or targeting journalists, requiring journalists to relocate to faraway places. And the trial judge, in this very stirring opinion, upheld that request for an injunction. It's now been overturned temporarily by the circuit court, although it's going to be reviewed again. And it's not clear how that's going to wind up. But I think what we're seeing here is that rights that we thought were secure in this country are not, and that we need new kinds of legal protections, including the measure adopted with the leadership of Representative Scanlon, as well as measures at the state level, both in courts and in legislatures, to guarantee rights that I think a lot of us thought were pretty well protected in this country, but have seen otherwise.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for giving us a sense of the legal framework for these cases and helping us understand that in Minneapolis, as you said, the claim is that state officials were in fact targeting journalists and interfering with their right to cover public events by refusing access to areas where events were unfolding, creating obstacles to reporters' movements in the city. And these incidents, according to the lawsuit, chill the constitutional rights of individual reporters as well as the public interest in the dissemination of accurate information. To all of our panelists, we're getting some great questions, including a request from several of our listeners that we focus on the law and try to avoid partisan politics. So for this round, let us focus on the legal framework. And Representative Scanlon, you have spoken eloquently about the history of protections for journalists, beginning with the John Peter Zenger trial in Philadelphia, which you say got some appropriate attention, but there are some other cases that you think are more relevant in establishing the modern framework for evaluating the rights of journalists. So tell us about Zenger and some other cases, and how, and you're a distinguished public interest lawyer before you were in Congress, how courts should evaluate these claims pitting the rights of journalists against actions by state and government officials.
Well, I don't think it can be overstated just how central the free press right is to our American system of government. Okay, so in 1735, this is the John Peter Zenger trial. So this is pre-Constitution. We're going back before the Constitution. Zenger was a printer in New York, and he published a number of articles that were critical of the British governor. And the British governor, for having the British governor had engaged in some seamy practices, and he was accusing the British governor of misconduct. So the British governor had him arrested and tried for sedition. Sedition being basically making fun of the king or his designees. So Zenger is in jail. He's not able to do his business, and some of the people of New York decided to hire the best lawyer possible, and that was a Philadelphia lawyer. See, this is why I have to tell this story as a Philadelphia lawyer. So that lawyer was not Alexander Hamilton, but Andrew Hamilton, and he came up and he defended John Peter Zenger. And there actually wasn't a good legal defense at the time, because the British king could charge someone with making fun of him and have them locked up. But what Zenger said is, wait, if it's true what Zenger did, if it's true what Zenger said about this British governor, that should be a defense. Truth should be a defense, because the people have the right to know what their government is doing. And this was a new concept. I mean, this was not part of the British constitutional system. The British constitutional system would have locked up Zenger, but essentially Andrew Hamilton persuaded the jury to let him free because truth was a defense. And that became embedded in our constitutional view with respect to the free press. It's one of the reasons that the First Amendment contains free press, a free press clause. And that's been part of our national conversation ever since. So the idea that you can call out the government for misconduct so long as it's true or essentially true, and that you don't do so with malice. So that does have some resonance today when we do hear from the administration some claims of fake news or the press being the enemy of the people. And in fact, that was why I thought it was so important that Congress come forward with a resolution reaffirming the free press. Because as Suzanne said, it's a new thing that we have this loss of respect for the importance and the role of our press in democracy. And we can point to some causation for that being undermining of the press. So Congress needs to step into the breach and say, no, this is a core value of our Constitution, and it's very important to our system. So that's the basis for the free press rights in America, and it's gone through a lot of iterations. New York Times versus Sullivan. There's a fairly big body of constitutional law in it now. But basically, if it's true, the press can print it. As long as it's about a public figure. And if you're a private figure, there are other protections for you.
Thank you very much for telling that wonderful Zenger story, for teaching us that it was Andrew, not Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Philadelphia lawyer. Our great constitutional prep team at the NCC informs me that there actually was a subsequent case where Alexander Hamilton argued, and it was the case, it was called People versus Croswell, that in fact, established the case that truth could be a defense, which Zenger wasn't able to do because the jury engaged in nullification and refused to convict. And in People versus Croswell, I love this detail with thanks to our phenomenal prep team. Hamilton, right before his death by duel, gave what Chancellor Kent called his greatest forensic effort ever. And it was a young Federalist journalist who reprinted a charge made in Hamilton's newspaper about President Jefferson. And Hamilton basically said that truth should be a defense. Zenger was a bad case because it hadn't established that principle. The court deadlocked, and in the end, it took a law passed by the New York legislature in 1805 to make truth a defense to a libel charge. And that was eventually embodied in the New York Constitution of 1821. Great details and really important to remember. Congressman Cohen, you also are a very distinguished public interest lawyer. You've argued and, or rather, been closely involved in First Amendment cases. It is a strong charge, but as you of course know and have written, in America, to be unprotected by the First Amendment, speech has to be intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. It's an extremely strong standard. And the Supreme Court held in 1969 in the Brandenburg case that even someone standing up at a Ku Klux Klan rally and engaging in racist hate speech was still protected because the speech, although reprehensible, was not intended to or likely to cause imminent violence. So in that sense, do you think the president's statements qualify as incitement and would be unprotected as speech under the legal standards or not?
Well, Mary Gay is really a scholar on these legal arguments, and I'm not as good on Alexander and Andrew Hamilton. I'd be better on Alexander and Andrew Coburn, but and they're journalists too. It's distinguished from politicians at Hamilton. But Mr. Lowry, and I really appreciated his predecessor, Mr. Buckley, he was a star, challenged us on what we said, and I need to respond. The fact is, I don't think presidents were putting people out of their press credentials like Mr. Acosta was put on probation or sent to the cloakroom by a president for asking questions. And I don't think we've had a president in Mr. Buckley's time or in your time either, Mr. Lowry, who was called on that OAN network to throw him softballs that Wilmer Defoe could hit for home runs on a regular basis, and to have them travel as the press representative on trips. And he's had other people travel as press representatives. He's done all he can to denigrate the press. He has set the climate that it's uniformly seen through all these, maybe it's a police problem, but maybe it's a climate that's been created from the top, telling police in New York to beat them up and treat them not so nice and punch them around, etc. And then to say fake news and you're the enemy of the people, and there they are, and point them out in crowds. You can't take away from the President of the United States, who has the bully pulpit, using it not like Teddy Roosevelt would, but in a way that's very unique. And it really truly does put our democracy at risk, as President Obama so well said at the Democratic Convention. Our democracy is at risk, definitely at risk, Rich. And I commend you, but I think you have to go back to the source of what's setting a tone in our country that is dangerous to all of us and dangerous to all of our rights.
Thank you for that, Rich. Of course, respond as you please, but if we could try to focus during this round on the legal claims and on whether.
Good luck, Jeff. We're in the thick of it now.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
I would just respond to that. Congressman, you're not going to get me to defend many of the things Donald Trump says and does. My magazine is extensively on the record saying it's wrong for him to call the press the enemy of the people and to do many of the other things that he says and does. And OAN is a schlock network. We ran an article attacking it a few issues ago. My objection is just, all that I think reasonable people can agree about, but this hyperbolic, hysterical rhetoric about 1930s Germany, and what we're specifically talking about this evening, which is police. Police are, again, no one addressed this point, perhaps because it's unaddressable, but police are answerable to local authorities. So what Democratic mayor out there is acting, directing his or her police department to act like 1930s Germany in a fascistic way. I think you should call him or her out right now. You have a national forum, do it. It'll have even more resonance since you're a fellow Democrat. I'm a conservative who's willing to criticize a Republican president. So I think turnabout's fair play. You should be a Democratic congressman who's willing to call out Democratic mayors, but I haven't heard it from you. I'm going to hear it from you tonight.
I would like to avoid a cross-file style debate, and let's just stick to our line.
Okay, so just one last general point. Just the idea that the right to protest is under threat in this country just seems otherworldly to me. For months now, 4 or 5 months, marches all the time. Some of them peaceful, but places like Portland, every night you have marches, and then you have a splinter group burning buildings, graffitiing buildings, harassing the mayor and residents in his condo. So the idea that this is a police state, it seems the opposite of the truth. In many places, the protests are not only just happening and haven't been suppressed, they're running out of control. So the perspective, with all due respect to my fellow panelists who are knowledgeable and sincere, the idea that we're living in a country where you can't protest or have your voice heard is manifestly absurd to anyone who's following what's happening in the streets, following the extensive media coverage, right? We're talking about, stupid arrest of a CNN reporter that shouldn't have happened, and he was immediately released. We're not talking about reporters getting jailed and tried with treason. That's a whole different phenomenon. Nor are these police officers exercising prior restraint on what anyone's saying or writing on TV. So I think in their sympathy with the protests and their enmity towards Donald Trump, my fellow panelists have a completely distorted view on this.
I do need to respond.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Suzanne, in your new book, Defending Free Speech, you have a series of suggestions for how people can maintain a commitment to free speech while also ensuring civil discourse. Your book is called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All, and the principles that you describe include principles for speaking, be conscientious with language, fulfill the duty of care, principles for listening, principles to follow when debating free speech questions, and principles to follow in considering speech-related policies. Give us a sense of, and about this question of incitement and hate speech. And the American standard, as you note in your book, is more speech protected than anything else in the world. And I'll just venture to conclude that the president's statements would not qualify as legal incitement, at least according to the standard in the Brandenburg case. They have to be intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. Is that standard one that you defend in your book? And how, given the great protection for even very hateful and inflammatory speech that falls short of incitement, do you believe that Americans can balance interests like dignity and equality against the First Amendment's protection for freedom of speech?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking about the book, Jeff. And I deal in the book with a related worry that I have, which is really that we are in danger of losing a rising generation that is becoming increasingly alienated from the principles of free speech. And you and I have talked some about issues of free speech on college campuses, and we've talked with some young students who have seen free speech invoked principally in relation to speech that they find menacing, discriminatory, racial slurs. And when they hear it brought up only in that context, they sort of ask the question, why is the First Amendment relevant to me? Isn't it just a... And my goal is to create a more inclusive, equal, anti-racist society in the way of that, and that the best answer to hateful speech is bans and prohibitions. And in the book, what I try to spell out is that the principles of equality and inclusion and of robust defense for free speech can and must be reconciled, that they actually are mutually reinforcing, but that we need an enlightened approach to free speech, which I spell out in those principles, that includes a measure of voluntary restraint on the part of speakers, being conscientious, avoiding inadvertent offense, being aware of the sensitivities of your audience. If you have a big platform, that's a larger obligation. I support the constitutional standard for the protection of hate speech. It is the world's most protective. There are other democracies that take a more restrictive approach, but the kinds of line drawing exercises that you get into when you empower government to police speech are incredibly difficult. And I think when governments have that power in their hands, they're going to use it in self-serving ways to attack critics, to suppress dissent, and to preserve their prerogatives. So I prefer our system, which curtails their ability to encroach upon speech in those ways. I do think we need to double down on other solutions and responses to hateful speech, including counter speech, dialogue, education, in some cases, condemnation, speaking out by institutional and political leaders to reject hateful speech. It's not a matter of just saying it's the First Amendment and throwing up your hands, but rather extra-legal, non-legal approaches to addressing, what I think has become a more serious problem over the last several years.
Thank you very much for that. Well, I think this is a good question for the other panelists, and I wonder whether we will or not agree on this constitutional question. Representative Scanlon, does the classic First Amendment standard that speech can only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence, do you believe that that's the correct standard and should be retained, or would you change it to allow the suppression of more hate speech? I think you're muted just briefly, so
sorry, had a dog barking in the background and wanted to exclude Abby from the conversation. But just as we can try to...
Abby. I might agree with Abby. Maybe Abby, the one person who agree with me here tonight.
There we go. She is barking mad. But at any rate, I think our classic democratic solution is that you counter speech with speech, except when there's an incitement to violence. So I don't see that we need to do that. But and I'm sure, Jeffrey, you will agree that one of the things we do need to maybe refocus on is civics education and making sure that people are critically evaluating the mass quantities of speech that we have to sift through now. If you're only getting all of your talking points from one source, then you're probably going to get a pretty biased view and think, for example, that Philadelphia is in flames every night, which of course it is not. So being able to assess and critically evaluate speech, I think is really important for everyone, and being able to weigh different viewpoints. So, you know, I don't think we should change the standard, but I do think that people need to be aware of the sources of their speech and look at, you know, the trustworthiness of different news sources, et cetera.
Great, thanks for that. Congressman Cohen, I know there's stuff you want to respond to with Rich Lowry, and please do, but before you do that, maybe just answer that first question. So far, both Suzanne Nossel and Congresswoman Scanlon have endorsed the traditional First Amendment standard that speech should only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. Do you also endorse that standard, or do you think it should be relaxed to allow the banning of more hate speech?
I think if it's looking and encouraging genocide, another Holocaust, hateful speech that's encouraging the death of a whole sect of people because of their race, their religion, their sexual orientation, their gender, I think that may be an area we should get into prohibiting. I mean, I don't appreciate free speech, but there's a time that you need to kind of maybe close the door. Back to Rich Lowry. I accept your challenge. I don't approve of looting, and I don't approve of rioting, and I don't approve of burning federal buildings or municipal buildings. And I didn't even like it when they took down Grant and some other character out in character's the wrong word, but individual out in San Francisco, and they've gone really too far, I think, in some of these things. No question about it. But I haven't called any Democratic mayors, nor have I called Republican mayors, where crime is up just as much in their communities as it is in Democratic cities. And that's a canard to say it's Democratic mayors. But, you know, I haven't called them out. And some of the protesters go way too far. And the press maybe is there. But when you see, like in Lafayette Park, and that's a place where the right to protest was definitely stopped. And the First Amendment, that was a peaceful protest. And the police, under the direction of Bill Barr, went in and put them aside so the president could hold up his Bible. He could just take out his Bible, and I was going to reach and get mine back here, but it's going to take too much effort, I guess, but just hold it up in front of that Episcopal church. Now, that was just wrong. And so that was an instance where free speech was obliterated and stopped for political purposes. And that does smack of the 1930s.
Thank you for that. Rich Lowry, respond as you like, but I think here's one. I know the answer to this question because I've read you on this. I think you do very much endorse the traditional First Amendment standard that speech should only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. Tell us why, and tell us why you think that the rest of the world, including Europe, which allows much greater banning of hate speech, including online, is wrong. And that leads to your recent defense of Mark Zuckerberg, where you said that he was correct to insist on trying to enforce standards that look much more like the American First Amendment standards than the European ones.
Well, the freedom of speech is a core human liberty. It goes to the exercise of conscience. And that the First Amendment is written in the Constitution, and we have much more robust protections for free speech than even other advanced countries, is one of the glories of the United States of America. So I very much would oppose moving off that incitement standard, because what you'll get, we've sort of heard it tonight, is dueling definitions of what hate speech is, and attempts by one side to silence the other, and vice versa. And that's just wrong. That's why we have the First Amendment. So I would hate to see any softening of the First Amendment. Not to pursue at length my exchange with the congressman, but the question I was raising is because at the outset you seem to suggest that these police or alleged police assaults on reporters were redolent of Nazi Germany and Soviet tactics and all the rest of it. And my point simply is that these police forces are answerable to democratic authorities. So if you really think that's the case, I would think you shouldn't take a pass. You should go after these democratic mayors, get them to rein in their police forces, ask them what they're doing. Instead, you make partisan points against Donald Trump because that's what's convenient to you. So your position, I find, with all due respect, completely inconsistent and opportunistic.
Thank you for that. Suzanne, we have three yays for maintaining the traditional incitement standard, and some a dissent from Congressman Cohen. I want now to turn to a lawsuit that Penn is involved with. It's actually a named plaintiff, Suzanne Nossel, in Penn America versus Trump. And on March 25th, a federal judge ruled that your lawsuit can proceed. And in that lawsuit, you identified at least 5 situations where you allege the president has used or threatened to use regulatory and enforcement powers of government to punish the speech of journalists. You say he's initiated a government review to raise postal rates to punish the owner of the Washington Post, directed DOJ enforcement actions against media companies, including CNN, interfered with White House press access, threatened to revoke broadcast licenses, and revoke the White House press credentials and security clearances of media commentators. Tell us what the current status of that case is and why you believe that those actions violate the First Amendment.
Sure. We've touched on in this conversation the president's verbal attacks on the press. And, the president has First Amendment rights as well. He can actually needle individual reporters. He can denigrate people. He can call the press the enemy of the American people. But what he cannot do is invoke the power of the federal government to retaliate against speech, particularly unfavorable, critical coverage, reporters he doesn't like, people who ask questions that he finds nettlesome. And that's what he has done repeatedly. In each of the instances that you outlined, he has either threatened and or taken action in retaliation against the press. And that, to us, and we think to any court, is a clear violation of the First Amendment. And it's the same thing that is brought up sort of in a different context in these lawsuits, both in Minneapolis and in Portland, which is the idea that the police were retaliating against coverage, that they were concerned about how they would come across, on camera and in the stories that these reporters were filing. And so they constricted journalists' ability to carry out their work and do their job as a way of exacting reprisal against that. And so there is some parallel in what we see. And, for us, this is a clear violation of the First Amendment, and we think it's extremely important to call it out. It's a novel case, only because we haven't had a president who has done this so brazenly, who makes clear his animus and who takes action on the basis of it. So the status of the case right now is it's under an interlocutory appeal. The government has tried to challenge the trial judge's determination that we have standing to proceed on the basis of these claims. And so she is evaluating whether to certify it as a kind of intermediate, immediate appeal that would go up to the Second Circuit. And we're waiting for an answer on that. But we think it's extremely important to establish the principle that no government official, be it a police officer, a university president, or even the president of the United States, has the authority to retaliate against constitutionally protected speech. And for us, as an organization that values the work of the free press, the fact that it's press freedom that's involved and these are journalists doing their job makes that principle, all the more important.
Many thanks for that. This is our last round, I think, in this vigorous discussion. And our great chatters are telling us they are enjoying it, but want us to focus on the First Amendment rather than partisan politics. So for this last round, let me ask each of you a version of this question. Congresswoman Scanlon, you convened us for this important discussion. You've introduced your resolution. Tell our friends in the audience what specifically you think that Congress, the courts, and other institutions can do to ensure the freedom of the press and the protection for journalists at this polarized time.
Well, as I said before, the purpose of the resolution was to reaffirm the importance of the free press at a time when it has been undermined. And as Suzanne said, the president, like everyone else, has a First Amendment right to speak. But the problem is when the president speaks, if he talks about a particular company, well, their stocks may tank. Or if the president denigrates a particular individual, people may attack that individual. So, we expect a higher standard. And if the president isn't going to reaffirm the rights of the free press and the centrality of a free press to our free and democratic government, then Congress needs to step up and speak to that importance, because that is what makes the American way and gives everybody the right to make their decisions based upon free and full information, not having one arm of the government put their thumb on it, whether through pre-existing limitations or arresting police or arresting members of the press, et cetera. And we have seen, just finally, particularly in Philadelphia, we have seen our mayor and our police department step up and step into some of those incidents and make sure that it was reaffirmed. We've seen that around the country. There was an attempt in Phoenix, for example, to put some limitations and hold the press to curfew laws. And there was pushback there, and the press institutions there said, no, you can't hold the press to a curfew law because they're there to report on what's going on in your city. So, the act of reminding people how important this is, it is part of maintaining the freedom of the press. So it's up to all of us to recognize when the press is being curtailed and to do what we can in our respective capacities.
Thank you so much for that. Congressman Cohen, of course, you also believe that Congress should step in, as indicated by your resolution. Maybe tell us what else you think can be done by judges and institutions like the Constitution Center, which is trying to educate the public about the Constitution. One of our commenters says that civic education in what the First Amendment requires is an important part of the solution. What else can we do?
Well, the First Amendment is so important, and the First Amendment Center was in Nashville, John Siegenthaler, and that was a wonderful institution. And I see behind you the "We the People" on your building. It reminds me of the beautiful frontis of the museum that we've lost in Washington. It's so sad that they took that down, but I guess Johns Hopkins wants to put Johns Hopkins up.
Can I just say, Congressman, we are hoping, and the museum is working with us, we want to bring that beautiful tablet to Philadelphia and put it outside the Constitution Center. So we hope to.
That would be. I'm a big supporter of the First Amendment, even though I have concerns. And my concerns, in Germany, they banned people from having Nazi flags and Nazi material. And that was an infringement of First Amendment rights of Germans, but they'd seen it up close and personal. As a Jewish person, I wasn't German. But I had ancestors that were killed in the concentration camps. They were killed by Nazism and by all of that genocide talk. And so that's why I think there could be an exception for type of speech that leads to genocide. Now, it's a fine line to draw it, but that's a fine line in any constitution and in the First Amendment. But I'm a big supporter of the First Amendment and the press. And the press is the fourth estate that shines light on public misdeeds. We've lost so many newspapers in the last 20 years or whatever. This was the first year I ran for office, and it used to be a big deal that you would get the endorsement of the newspaper. I had a Democratic primary, and there was no endorsement. Gannett has taken over the newspapers in Tennessee. They've become almost like shoppers' newses. And there was no endorsement in the primaries. I guess they'll endorse in the presidential race. I don't know. But that was something the newspapers used to do. Give light and the people will see the way. That was what the press senator's motto was. It was an afternoon paper here that no longer exists. Newspapers and that's not because of any government action. It's just public's going to television and the more sensational things, and print media is going out. To Mr. Lowry, I tried to refresh my memory the best I could. I couldn't do reverse and rewind. I don't think I said that the police situations with protesters was like Nazi Germany. I think what I said was when Trump directed the attention at his rallies to CNN and news reporters and put their focus on them, and the people in the crowd started jeering them and jostling them and putting them in probably reasonable risk of danger. That's different from the police. That is a president who purposely takes the police on as his, the press on as his foil. And I believe that's what I referenced. And I believe that your suggestion about me and the police was wrong. And that's not what I see as a police state. That's not what I see as 1930s Germany. And that's no reason to call Mayor Wheeler. It's a reason to call President Trump.
Yeah, I accept
Thank
your
you for that. Let me just set up your closing, Rich Lowry, if I may, by saying, despite the vigorous debate between you and the congressman, which has been illuminating, it is striking to me that 3 of the panelists have argued for maintaining the traditional First Amendment standard that speech can only be banned when it's intended to and likely to incite violence. What would you say to our friends in the audience about what Congress, the courts, and citizens can do to defend that standard, which so many of you agree on?
First of all, just to end on a relatively warm note, I'm going to let you off easy, Congressman. If you we're not criticizing police conduct, which was what we were talking about at the outset. I misinterpreted you. I thought you were. I still think any comparisons to Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are completely insane, but we'll take that up over a drink sometime. So I think what Congress can do foremost is no harm. Don't pursue campaign finance reform that is blatantly in violation of the First Amendment. Don't pursue hate crime laws, hate speech laws that are blatantly in violation of the First Amendment. I think the most important question at this period of time in our national life goes to citizens, and it goes to something that Suzanne was saying earlier. Speech that you disagree with, speech that makes you angry, speech that you even feel is hateful is not a physical threat to you. You don't respond by trying to shut that person down, by chasing them off a podium at a college campus, or God forbid, assaulting them. You respond by stating your contrary view. That is debate in a free republic. That is what makes this country great. And viewers out there might agree with me, they might agree with the congressman, but we have demonstrated, and I'm going to try to tie a nice little bow around this, Jeff. We've demonstrated the benefits of living in a country where people can get together and have vigorous argument and try to persuade. That is at the taproot of the American Republic and should be defended at all costs, not just by Congress, not just by the judiciary, not just by elected officials, but by every citizen in the country.
Vigorous argument and try to persuade are inspiring words. And I think that's just what we're having tonight. And Suzanne, you can send us off with your final thoughts. And you're perfectly equipped to do that because in your great new book, and I've got to mention the title one more time so folks can check it out, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. You both defend the traditional First Amendment incitement standard, but at the same time give practical advice for how citizens in this extraordinarily polarized and partisan time can speak to each other in a way that they can vigorously debate and ultimately persuade.
Sure. I mean, one point I would add to this conversation is something that I devote a chapter of my book to, which is the idea that we need to avoid politicizing free speech. I was pretty disturbed when I heard Donald Trump Jr. at the Republican National Convention claiming free speech as a squarely and purely Republican value. And I understand, where that comes from, but I think this is a value that ought to be above politics. And it's extremely important as we engage with the rising generation that we instill in them. And another chapter of my book is devoted to the idea that speech and violence must not be equated, and that equivalency is dangerous and inimical to free speech. But if we want to bring around this rising generation to accepting that, we also need to acknowledge the harms of speech. We need to be conscientious with language. Just as we wrap, I was struck by your question about what we should be doing about press freedom. And I think there are sort of 3 interlocking dangers that we haven't talked much about, but that I think are part of this larger equation. One, Representative Cohen touched on, which is the crisis in local news and the fact that 50% of staffs of local newsrooms across the country have been slashed over the past several years. We've seen more than 20% of all local news outlets shut down completely. And that to me is a crisis for democracy, and one that does require action in Washington. Part of the answer, not the whole answer, but part of the answer is re-examining our system of public funding to ensure that local news remains robust. That's the news channel avenue that people across the country, citizens trust the most, more so than national news. The second is fraudulent news and disinformation, which is a deepening crisis and intensified by both the COVID pandemic and the upcoming election. And the blurring of lines between actual responsible professional journalism and propaganda, whether foreign and domestic, which information that is deliberately intended to deceive and mislead has been blurred. And that is a crisis for our whole news ecosystem and for press freedom rights. And then finally, relatedly, this deepening media partisanship and the blurring of the lines between just journalism and opinion and sort of talk television that looks like journalism, but really is something different. And I think we've got to look as a citizenry and in institutions like the Constitution Center and PEN America at how we address all of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all PEN America is doing to promote values of constitutionalism and nonpartisanship. And dear C-SPAN and NCC friends who are watching, I'm thrilled to share that you can continue your constitutional education with a series of live classes on the Constitution that my colleagues and I at the center have launched. We just started this week. On Friday, David Cohen of the College Board and I will be talking about why it's important to study the Constitution and the founding documents. But 3 times a week at noon and 2 o'clock, if your kids are learning at home, tune in and watch us live or watch the archive videos where we believe that the central solution to the partisanship that is afflicting America is constitutional education. We're trying to do our part to provide this free service, and we hope you will join us. Thanks to all of our friends in the audience for their great questions. Thanks to our panelists for a vigorous and illuminating discussion where we, if we didn't persuade each other, certainly spread constitutional light. Thanks to all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.